Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, your heart racing as if it had been pounding for hours. The weight of fear grips your chest, leaving you breathless, unable to shake the sense that something is terribly wrong. This isn't a typical nightmare. This is something much darker, something that haunts you long after you've woken. In tonight's story, we'll unravel the terrifying experience of a 38-year-old man from Rio de Janeiro, who found himself trapped between the waking world and something far worse, something supernatural that bled into his reality. But as you'll see, this tale isn't one of fiction. It's a true account, where the boundaries of dreams and reality blur, and where a forgotten family connection might just be the key to unraveling a nightmare that refuses to die. As we begin this journey into fear, I ask you, have you ever experienced something so strange, so inexplicable, that it made you question everything you thought you knew about the world? Tonight, you're going to hear a story that might just do that to you. Before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share this terrifying tale with your friends. If you or someone you know has ever experienced something similar, we'd love to hear your story. Now, let's dive into a chilling story that will make you wonder, are we ever really alone? This eerie introduction sets the stage for what promises to be a disturbing journey, one where the terror creeps into every corner of the protagonist's life. With every sentence, we're invited into the unknown, where even the most familiar places can turn into a living nightmare. The night had settled over Rio de Janeiro like a suffocating blanket, the sky thick with clouds that blocked out the moon, casting the city in an unnatural darkness. Inside a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, the air felt heavier than usual, almost as if the walls themselves were closing in. The faint hum of distant traffic outside seemed distant, too, muffled by the oppressive silence that had taken over. It was in this silence that something felt off, something that could not be explained, something that lingered in the corners of the room. The apartment itself, though small, had once been a place of comfort for our protagonist. It was filled with memories of better times, photos of family gatherings, old books stacked neatly by the shelf, and the scent of lavender lingering from the last time he'd cleaned. But tonight, everything felt different. The wooden floors creaked beneath his feet as he moved through the living room, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The furniture, once familiar and welcoming, now appeared imposing, almost as if it were watching him. Even the faint glow of the streetlights outside, casting long shadows into the room, seemed to distort the space, making it appear larger and more ominous than it was. As he moved toward the kitchen to grab a drink, the apartment felt like a labyrinth, every turn and corner seemingly unfamiliar, like the walls had shifted while he wasn't looking. The faint smell of something rotten, something decayed, wafted in the air, though he couldn't place its source. It was sharp, nauseating, a smell that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. He had tried cleaning every inch of the place, but it always returned, creeping back into the room as if it were a part of the apartment's very foundation. But it wasn't just the smells that unsettled him. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, the kind of drop that made his breath visible in the air, even though the windows were tightly shut. Goosebumps prickled his skin as he walked back into the living room. It felt like the house was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, and for a moment he swore he saw them move, as if something were lurking just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the dim light. The stillness of the apartment was deafening, and yet, in that silence, he could hear something that wasn't quite right, the faintest rustle, like the sound of someone shifting in the dark. Suddenly, the apartment didn't feel like his own. It felt alien, hostile. The once familiar walls seemed to whisper his name, calling him into the dark corners, beckoning him towards something he wasn't ready to face. The calm he once found in this space was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread that made his heart beat faster with each passing second. We craft an atmosphere thick with tension. The details of the apartment, the oppressive darkness, the unsettling smells, the inexplicable changes in temperature, build a sense of fear and paranoia. The setting becomes a character in itself, distorting the familiar into something nightmarish. Every little detail in the apartment works to unsettle the viewer, pulling them deeper into the mystery of what's really happening. It started with something subtle, so faint that it could be brushed off as a trick of the mind. A shift in the air, almost imperceptible, like a faint breeze whispering through the cracks of the apartment, even though every window was closed tight. The temperature, which had been uncomfortably cold, suddenly spiked, an unnerving heat that prickled the skin, as if the room had become saturated with a presence that didn't belong. But it was the smell that began to make him question his sanity. It wasn't just any smell, it was putrid, like something rotting just out of sight, creeping in from the walls themselves. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he was convinced he must be imagining it. Maybe it was the humidity of Rio, or maybe it was something in the plumbing. But he knew deep down it wasn't natural. He stood still in the middle of the living room, trying to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. The clock ticked on the wall, the only sound in the oppressive silence, but there was something wrong about its ticking now. It felt too loud, as though time itself was echoing in the empty space. His gaze darted to the door leading to the veranda, a faint flicker of movement catching his eye. Something was there. He couldn't explain why he felt drawn to it, but an overwhelming compulsion made him slowly approach. He reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a chill up his spine. When he opened the door, the air outside hit him like a wave, colder than it should have been for the time of year. And then there was a noise, distant at first, but unmistakable. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. His blood ran cold. He froze, heart hammering in his chest as the sound grew louder, closer, as if something unseen was moving in the apartment with him. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the room in frantic desperation, but there was nothing. Just shadows, stretching further into the corners of the room, as though they were growing, pulling in from every direction. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but the shadows felt alive. The air was thick with something dark, something that clung to his skin, made his breath shallow. The smell was stronger now, decay rot, like something long dead had returned to claim this place. A low hum filled the room next, vibrating through the floorboards and walls, a sound that seemed to come from deep inside the earth itself. It reverberated in his chest, a constant reminder that something unnatural was happening. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. Panic gripped him, and he turned to look around once again. The apartment, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a suffocating, unwelcoming space filled with unseen horrors. That's when he heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, from the hallway. Someone, or something, was in the apartment with him. He wasn't alone. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the hallway, every muscle in his body frozen in terror, knowing whatever it was getting closer. In this section, the terror intensifies as the subtle signs of something wrong, strange smells, shifts in temperature, and eerie sounds, begin to disrupt the protagonist's sense of reality. The setting continues to warp into something hostile and unnerving. The feeling of being watched and the presence of something unseen lurking in the apartment pulls the viewer deeper into the mystery, ramping up the tension. The protagonist is caught in a growing sense of dread, unsure whether he's losing his grip on reality or if something truly malevolent is happening around him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to leave the apartment and never come back. But his feet remained rooted to the spot, frozen by the overwhelming fear clawing at his chest. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, were now unmistakably close. He could hear the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their weight, moving closer, one step at a time. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except for the terror that had settled deep inside his bones. He glanced at the hallway once more, dread suffocating him. His mind raced. Should he leave? Should he call someone? But who could he trust with this? How could he explain what was happening when he himself didn't understand it? He took a slow, deliberate step back, his breath shallow, every sense on high alert. The air felt thick, almost as though it were closing in around him, the temperature fluctuating wildly from scorching heat to an icy cold that made his skin prickle. The smell, decay, rot, was stronger now, almost suffocating, as if something was festering in the very walls of the apartment. The footsteps were nearer now, closer than ever, but there was still no one there. No figure, no shadow, just that unnerving sound that grew louder and louder. Was he losing his mind? Was it possible that all of this, the smell, the footsteps, the dark shadows, were the products of his overactive imagination? His grip on reality was beginning to slip, each passing second making him question whether this was all in his head. Or worse, whether the thing stalking him was something far worse than a mere hallucination. Then came the voice. It wasn't a whisper or a murmur, but a low, guttural sound, like something trying to form words, but in a language that didn't belong. It echoed in his mind, as much as it did in the empty room, vibrating his very bones. His legs trembled beneath him, his knees threatening to buckle. He had to make a choice, stand and confront whatever was lurking in the apartment, or run, and leave it all behind. But the idea of leaving filled him with a new dread. What if it followed him? What if whatever was here wasn't bound to this place, but could follow him wherever he went? His breath caught in his throat as the voice came again, clearer this time, and unmistakably familiar. It was his grandmother's voice, the one he had heard in his dream, calling his name from somewhere deep within the darkness. I gave her the name. The words seemed to hold a power of their own, reverberating through the air. His mind spun, the connection between the nightmare and his reality becoming impossible to ignore. Was this all a warning? Was it a message from beyond the grave, or was his mind playing cruel tricks on him? A wave of nausea hit him, but he steeled himself. He knew deep down that if he didn't face whatever was in the apartment, he would never be free. His curiosity, tangled with the fear, pushed him forward, towards the dark hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. His body moved on its own accord, propelled by the need for answers, even as his mind screamed at him to turn back. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know what it was, who it was, and what it wanted. He took another step, and then another. The footsteps in the hallway stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breath. His eyes scanned the hallway, heart racing with anticipation and terror. And then, from the darkness, something moved, just a flicker at first, like a shadow darting across the wall. But it was real. It was there. He wasn't alone. The protagonist faces a critical decision. Should he confront the terrifying unknown or flee from the horror that's closing in around him? The tension builds as the stakes get higher, and his internal struggle intensifies. The familiarity of the voice, the growing presence in the apartment, and the overwhelming fear push him to confront the terror head-on. The decision to move forward, despite his fear, heightens the suspense, bringing the protagonist closer to whatever supernatural force has invaded his home. As he stepped forward into the darkness, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Each movement felt like it was being watched, like invisible eyes were tracing his every step. The hallway stretched ahead, unnaturally long, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him, the shadows pulling him deeper into the unknown. The faint scraping sound, once distant, now echoed around him, sharp and maddening, like nails dragging against wood. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his throat. The temperature dropped again, this time so abruptly that his breath puffed out in thick clouds of condensation. The rot in the air was unbearable now, so thick and putrid that it made his stomach turn, and yet he couldn't pinpoint the source. His gaze moved along the hallway, every shadow seeming to move of its own accord, shifting and writhing, like something was lurking just out of sight. The further he ventured, the more distorted the world around him became. And then he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. A woman, her silhouette shrouded in darkness, her outline too clear to ignore, yet too distorted to be fully human. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto her form, unable to look away. It was his grandmother. No, not her, but something that resembled her. She stood unnaturally still, her back to him, and yet he could feel her presence weighing on him like an unholy force. For a moment, everything froze. The world felt suspended in time, the air thick and suffocating. Then, with a jolt, the figure turned. Her face, once so familiar, was now a grotesque mockery of itself, pale, almost lifeless, her eyes black holes, empty and consuming. She smiled at him, but it wasn't a warm, comforting smile. It was cold, twisted, as if she knew something he didn't, something he could never comprehend. The room felt like it was closing in around him, the walls pushing inward, the shadows stretching like fingers, grasping at his limbs, pulling him toward her. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed by a terror so deep it felt like it had crawled inside his skin and taken root. I gave her the name, the voice whispered, but it wasn't his grandmother's voice anymore. It was deeper, more guttural, the sound scraping against his mind like nails on a chalkboard. The figure took a step toward him, her body jerking unnaturally, each movement too fluid and wrong. Her feet scraped against the floor, dragging like a corpse pulled from the grave. The sound was deafening. As she drew closer, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. His breath clouded in the air, and the smell of decay, of something dead and rotting, overwhelmed him. It was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. His eyes blurred, his chest tightened, but he couldn't look away. The thing, his grandmother's form, was right in front of him now, her face twisted in agony, yet her eyes never left his. I gave her the name, she repeated, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a demand, and the air itself seemed to shudder with it. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the figure lunged. His heart stopped. For one brief, terrible second, he thought he was going to die. But instead, she passed right through him, an icy, oppressive presence that made his skin crawl. It was as if she was never truly there, but the cold, the terror, the smell, they all remained, hanging heavy in the air. Staggering back, gasping for breath, he turned to flee. But the hallway was no longer the same. The walls had closed in, the space had shrunk, and the shadows had thickened, becoming almost tangible. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and it wasn't just the figure of his grandmother. It was everything. The very apartment was alive, breathing, changing around him, and it wouldn't let him go. The protagonist finally confronts the supernatural force that has been stalking him throughout the story. The tension reaches its peak as the figure of his grandmother, twisted and unrecognizable, appears in the hallway, a horrifying manifestation of the terror that has haunted him. The encounter is visceral, filled with disturbing imagery and a sense of dread that intensifies with every moment. The supernatural presence feels overwhelming and suffocating, and the protagonist's growing realization that he is trapped in a nightmare escalates the fear, leaving the viewer unsettled and on edge. As the figure of his grandmother vanished into the cold, oppressive air, the apartment around him seemed to exhale, the heavy silence returning with a vengeance. The temperature remained frozen, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were pressing in on him, trying to smother him with their secrets. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of the dread that had been building for hours bear down on him. It was then, in the suffocating stillness, that he heard it again, a voice. This time it wasn't his grandmother's, but something deeper, more ancient, and far more menacing. I gave her the name, the words echoed in his head, a constant refrain that seemed to reverberate from the very walls of the apartment. But now they didn't just linger, they were taking shape, becoming something more sinister, more real. The voice was coming from everywhere at once, surrounding him, filling his mind. You must understand, you were never meant to escape. Panic flooded through him, and he stumbled back toward the door, desperate to flee the suffocating presence that was closing in. But the door wouldn't open. The handle refused to turn. The frame seemed to pulse with an unnatural force, as if the apartment itself had decided he would not leave. He could feel the walls pressing in on him, and the sensation of being trapped, completely isolated from the world outside, was almost unbearable. The smell of rot had returned, stronger now, mingled with something else, something metallic like blood. His legs shook with fear, and the floor beneath him seemed to shift, as if the very foundation of the building was sinking into something darker. And then, as if the universe itself had conspired to tear open the fabric of his reality, the truth hit him like a hammer to the skull. The name, the cryptic words from his grandmother, the strange smell, the ghostly presence, it all connected in an instant. He remembered a conversation he had overheard years ago, a whisper between relatives about a long-forgotten family curse, something that had been passed down for generations, hidden away from the living. They had always warned him not to dig too deep into the family's past, to never ask too many questions about what happened before. He had ignored the warnings, thinking it was just superstition. But now he understood. This wasn't a haunting, this was something far worse. His grandmother had been part of something dark and ancient. She had made a pact, a deal that involved more than just the living. And now he was caught in the aftermath of that pact. The apartment, the smell, the voice, it was all tied to a name that had been given, perhaps to him, perhaps to something much darker. The revelation hit him like a cold wave, and he understood that he had been living under a curse all along. He wasn't meant to escape, he was meant to be a part of it, part of a twisted legacy that had no end, no escape. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching like claws, reaching out for him as the truth sank in. The past had come to claim him, and there was no escaping the horrors that were now bound to his very soul. The shadows moved faster now, swirling around him like a storm, engulfing him in darkness. His breath came in gasps, each one shallow, each one more desperate. He was suffocating, trapped in the web of the past. And then in the deepest part of the darkness, he saw it. The figure of his grandmother again, only this time, her eyes were fully black, her face a grotesque mask of malice and pain. She smiled at him again, but there was no warmth in it, only the promise of something much worse to come. I gave her the name, she whispered again, but this time, the words were not a warning, they were a curse. The apartment around him began to shift, to warp, and he realized too late that the terror wasn't bound by these walls. It was bound to him, to his blood, to the very name that had been given. And it would follow him for as long as he lived. The terror culminates with the protagonist's shocking realization about the curse that has plagued his family for generations. The intensity of the revelation is heightened by the oppressive atmosphere, the suffocating fear that grips him as he understands that the supernatural events aren't just a haunting. They are part of a much darker, far-reaching legacy. The horror is no longer confined to the apartment, but has embedded itself within him, bound to his blood and his past. The shadows close in, and the protagonist is left with the harrowing truth that there is no escape from the terror he has awakened. This revelation deepens the mystery, turning the story into a nightmare that cannot be undone. The room had become a prison, the walls closing in on him with a relentless pressure that seemed to crush the very air out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, his mind racing, trying to process the overwhelming weight of the revelation. The truth had shattered him. He wasn't just haunted by ghosts. He was marked, cursed by something far older and far more powerful than he could ever comprehend. The apartment around him was no longer just a space. It was alive, pulsing with a malignant energy that thrummed beneath the floorboards, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. As he turned toward the door, his last hope of escape, he found it no longer opened into the world outside. The handle, cold and unyielding, refused to turn, the door a solid barrier that mocked him, trapping him in the suffocating nightmare. Panic surged through him, his pulse quickening as he grasped at the door in a frantic attempt to break free. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker, creeping toward him like tendrils reaching for his soul. The once familiar smell of decay was overpowering now, thickening the air until he could barely breathe. It was as though the very space around him had begun to rot from the inside out, and the stench of death clung to every surface. The walls seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic thrum, and the shadows twisted, contorted, and writhed in ways that defied logic. In the darkness, he heard whispers, soft, guttural voices that spoke in tongues, a language he didn't understand, but that still sent chills down his spine. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her again, his grandmother. But she was no longer the figure of gentle warmth he once remembered. Her face was now a grotesque mask of suffering, her eyes hollow black pits that seemed to suck in the light around her. Her mouth moved, but the words she spoke were garbled and indecipherable, drowned by the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. The curse had her, and it was coming for him next. In that moment, he understood. The terror wasn't just in the apartment. It was in him, coursing through his veins, etched into his very being. It had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The name, his name, had bound him to this nightmare, to this cursed lineage that had never truly let him go. There was no escaping it, no running from it. The shadows surged forward, engulfing him in an impenetrable darkness. He reached out, desperate to find the light, but it was gone. The apartment, once a home, had transformed into a labyrinth of terror, a place of endless torment. He could feel the cold fingers of death wrap around him, pulling him into the depths of despair. His body trembled, his mind racing, but there was no escape, no way out. And then, the darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard before the world went silent was the voice of his grandmother, speaking those cursed words again. I gave her the name. But this time, they were not a warning. They were a final, irrevocable sentence. In the days that followed, the apartment remained undisturbed. The smell of decay lingered, but there was no sign of the man who had once lived there. Neighbors would later say that the building had been empty for years, that no one had ever lived in that apartment since the tragic disappearance of a man named. I gave her the name. Was it all just a haunting, or had the man been claimed by something far worse, something beyond human understanding? The apartment stood empty, its windows dark, its doors sealed. But the whispers, those quiet, haunting whispers, never stopped. They carried on in the silence of the night, growing louder, as if waiting for someone new to come along. A new victim to fulfill the curse, a new soul to claim. The protagonist faces the inevitable fate of the curse that has haunted him all along. The terror is no longer confined to the supernatural elements of the apartment. It is now part of him, inescapable and relentless. The creeping shadows, the oppressive darkness, and the whispers all conspire to pull him into a final confrontation with his doomed fate. The ending is disturbing and ambiguous, leaving the viewer with a lingering sense of unease and the haunting question of whether the curse will ever truly end. The apartment, the terror, and the curse live on, haunting the space long after the protagonist is gone. The days following his disappearance seemed to blur together. The apartment, once filled with the oppressive energy of terror, now stood still and quiet, as though nothing had ever disturbed its peace. The lingering scent of decay had faded, but something else remained, a sense of unease, a lingering presence that refused to leave. No one in the building knew what had truly happened to the man who had lived there. His absence became a mystery, whispered about in hushed tones whenever the building's tenants gathered. The apartment, once a place of normalcy, had now become a symbol of something darker, a place cursed and haunted by forces beyond understanding. But one evening, a neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades, ventured into the apartment. Curiosity had gnawed at her for some time, a persistent need to uncover what had happened. When she walked inside, her breath caught in her throat. The place was untouched, still holding the heavy silence of something wrong. But there was more to it. There, in the corner of the living room, lay an old photograph, one that hadn't been there before. It was a picture of the man, but this time, something was different. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were now hollow, as if they had seen too much. The faintest of smiles twisted his lips, but it was no longer comforting. It was a grimace, an expression of someone trapped in a nightmare they could not escape. She reached for the picture, her hand trembling, and as her fingers brushed the glass, a chill ran up her spine. The photograph flickered, almost imperceptibly, but enough for her to see. The man's face morphed, his eyes darkening, becoming empty voids, and a low whisper seemed to emanate from the picture itself. She dropped it in horror, the glass shattering as it hit the floor. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. I gave her the name. Her heart pounded in her chest as the room around her seemed to warp. The air thickened, becoming suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. It was then that she saw it, a shadow in the doorway, just beyond her vision. It was faint, flickering in and out of focus, but it was unmistakably there. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadow slowly stepped forward, and as it did, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay. The figure emerged from the darkness, and it was him. Or rather, it was something that resembled him. His eyes were now fully black, his skin ashen, his mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. The man she had once known was gone, replaced by something far more horrifying. The curse had claimed him, body and soul, and now it was calling to her. I gave her the name, he whispered, his voice distorted and hollow. His form flickered, shifting between the shadows and reality, and with each passing second, it seemed to grow closer. She turned to run, but her legs refused to move. Fear held her in place, as though the very space around her was pushing her to stay, to face whatever had taken hold of the apartment. In a frantic attempt to escape, she broke the stillness of the air, shouting for help. But when she looked back, the figure was gone. The room returned to its original, empty state. The temperature normalized, the oppressive feeling dissipating. But the damage had already been done. Her sanity, her sense of reality, was shattered. As she left the apartment, she could still hear it, the faint whisper lingering in the depths of her mind. I gave her the name. Days turned into weeks, and the woman's mind began to unravel. She could no longer tell where the nightmare began or ended. The whispers followed her, persistent, unrelenting. It became a part of her, a dark presence that could not be shaken. No matter where she went, no matter how far she traveled, it clung to her, a curse she could never escape. She too had become bound to the apartment, to the name that was never meant to be uttered. And so the cycle continued, each person who ventured too close to the apartment finding themselves drawn into the nightmare, never truly able to break free. The whispers never stopped, and the shadows never ceased their reach. The curse, it seemed, was eternal, forever bound to the space, to the name, to the souls who dared to discover its dark truth. As the apartment stood empty once more, the whispers grew louder in the night, a warning to those who dared to listen too closely. And so the mystery remained, an unresolved horror, waiting for the next curious soul to unravel its twisted depths. I gave her the name. The story takes a chilling turn as the neighbor becomes a new victim of the curse, trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror. The lingering sense of dread that permeates the apartment continues to claim those who approach it, further cementing the idea that the horror is not just a one-time occurrence. It is an enduring force that spreads, contaminating anyone who dares to uncover the dark secrets within. The epilogue leaves the audience with a haunting reflection on the nature of the curse, reinforcing the terror that even after the protagonist's disappearance, the nightmare continues to haunt those around it.